Well, I'm not sure what to make of AMD's RDNA 4 announcement, to be honest. The company has just announced the Radeon RX 9000 series for the second time, headlined by the RX 9070 XT and its $600 US MSRP. There's some interesting features and architectural details to explore, but I'm a bit iffy on the price based on what AMD has shown so far. It doesn't look necessarily bad or like it's a huge flop, but on the surface it looks to be more of a continuation of AMD's graphics card strategy rather than a big shift towards providing better value. Will that be enough this generation? Certainly some interesting times ahead for the Red team. So the RX 9070 XT will be available on March 6th at a $600 or $599 US asking price. It comes with a fully unlocked Navi 48 die featuring 64 RDNA 4 compute units, a boost clock up to 2.97 GHz, 16 GB of GDDR6 memory, and a 304 watt TDP. I wouldn't go so far as to say $600 is an awful price for this model. Thankfully they didn't go with something even crazier, but it lacks a bit of wow factor. Fine, okay sort of price, but not great if you know what I mean. To understand this value proposition, we first have to look at how fast AMD claims the RX 9070 XT is. They say it's 42% faster on average than the RX 7900 GRE at 4K, though this overall average of 30 games includes both raster and ray tracing titles. If we look at the average of the 11 raster examples on the left, we get a 37% uplift. For 9 ray tracing examples on the right, we get an average uplift of 53%. In other words, RDNA 4 is providing a bigger boost to ray tracing than raster, as has been widely rumoured. Compared to our benchmark results, a 37% improvement over the 7900 GRE would make the 9070 XT about 10% faster than the RX 7900 XT for rasterized gaming. With the 7900 XTX being 22% faster than the 7900 XT, the 9070 XT is therefore expected to sit between those two RDNA 3 models, roughly on par with or slightly below the RTX 5070 Ti, which we have as 14% faster than the 7900 XT at 4K. For ray tracing, a 53% improvement to performance would place the 9070 XT about 10 to 15% above the RX 7900 XTX. However, this would still see it fall well short of the RTX 5070 Ti. Based on our current data, this would place it slightly behind the RTX 4070 Super, which is expected to be about where Nvidia's RTX 5070 lands based on its hardware configuration. In the best cases, we'd expect the 9070 XT to possibly approach RTX 4070 Ti levels of ray tracing, but in the worst cases more like a 4070 Super, but still around 20% slower or more than the 5070 Ti. At $600 US, AMD appears to be offering RTX 5070 Ti level rasterization performance at a 20% lower price, MSRP versus MSRP, and with ray tracing performance likely 20% plus slower. This is based on first-party data, which is likely cherry-picked to some degree too, but for the sake of this analysis, let's assume it's spot on. The 9070 XT does have FSR 4 going for it and a few other features, but a lot hinges on the quality of FSR 4 versus DLSS 4 and the number of supported games. Theoretically, 20% better value than the 5070 Ti for raster isn't awful, but it's exactly what AMD has done previously with cards like the RX 7900 XTX versus RTX 4080 and RX 7800 XT versus RTX 4070. Those cards were some of the better models in AMD's lineup with around 20% lower cost per frame than their GeForce competitors, and they hardly sold like hotcakes. This is why we concluded earlier this year that AMD probably needs to offer more than that sort of value to entice current GeForce owners, which are the vast majority of PC gamers, to switch over to the Radeon brand with their next upgrade. This also doesn't factor in stuff like ray tracing, which is usable in these sorts of tiers. It's going to be dicey as to whether the 9070 XT or 5070 Ti offers better value for ray tracing, and ultimately the Radeon model will be disappointing if those interested in ray tracing should just get the GeForce card as usual. Will offering better raster value but worse ray tracing value resonate with gamers again when they already did that last generation? Not sure. The other point of contention with this price is the direct comparison to the RX 7900 XT. While currently discontinued for almost the entirety of 2024, you were able to purchase a 7900 XT for $700 US, with a period between October and December where the price fell to $650. This means that for all intents and purposes, the 7900 XT's price was no more than $700 US. With the 9070 XT, AMD is shaving just 14% off this price, while claiming to offer around 10% more raster performance, better ray tracing, and FSR 4. That would be, for raster performance, a 22% decrease in cost per frame generation on generation, which is hardly earth-shattering. Again, not horrible, a little better than the generational value improvement from the 5070 Ti versus 4070 Ti Super, but it's not mind-blowing. There is a value add here compared to the 7900 XT because of the gains made in other areas, but AMD is heavily banking on those things, ray tracing, FSR, encoding quality, instead of raw baseline performance per dollar. A potential saving grace here would be if RTX 5070 Ti's continue to be in limited supply and price more like $900 US. From AMD's perspective, that's a pretty huge gamble to be making because if Nvidia decided to increase supply and make the 5070 Ti broadly available at the MSRP, the RX 9070 XT would be much less attractive. At $600 for the 9070 XT versus $900 for the 5070 Ti, I think it will be incredibly hard to justify the Nvidia card, but that gap narrows substantially if Nvidia suddenly increases supply overnight and the card becomes $750, which I certainly wouldn't rule out. Then we get to the RX 9070, which AMD have priced at $549 US and will also be available on March 6th. This model is based on the same Navi 48 die, cut down to 56 compute units. The boost clock is dropped to 2.52 GHz, and the TDP is lower as well, just 220 watts. However, the 16GB of GDDR6 memory is retained, which is definitely a good move. I find the $550 price here a bit bizarre, to be honest, and this seems like a bit of a misstep from AMD, similar to the 7700 XT versus 7800 XT last generation. With the 9070 XT slotting in 42% faster than the 7900 GRE, and the 9070 at 21% faster than the GRE, these are AMD's claims, that implies the 9070 is 15% slower than the 9070 XT. But the price is only 8% cheaper, which makes no sense. Generally, lower spec cards should never be worse value than high spec cards. At worst, they should be similar value or ideally offering better value. Instead, this pricing suggests AMD are doing the opposite and trying to upsell you to the $50 more expensive 9070 XT. My initial reaction here is this card won't be very popular as a result, with the vast majority of attention going to the XT model. Once again, if we split out the raster and RT numbers, AMD is showing a 19% improvement in the raster titles on average and a 26% improvement to ray tracing. A 19% improvement to raster over the 7900 GRE would mean the RX 9070 falls short of the RX 7900 XT performance based on our benchmarking of existing cards. It would likely be faster than the RTX 4070 Super, aka the expected performance of the RTX 5070, maybe by around 10%. A 26% improvement to ray tracing would have it sit between the RX 7900 XT and RX 7900 XTX in performance, which now testing would be around 25% slower than the RTX 4070 Super, though they could heavily depend on the VRAM limitations for ray tracing in certain titles because the AMD card does have more VRAM. With a price tag of $550, this seems super underwhelming, just a 20% increase in value compared to AMD's own RX 7900 GRE, which also launched at $550. And relative to the upcoming RTX 5070 with its $550 MSRP, we could be seeing just 10% better raster value and much worse ray tracing value. Yes, the 9070 crucially comes with more VRAM at 16GB versus 12 on the 4070 Super and 5070, but is that going to be enough to convince the gaming masses? I'm not convinced, and it doesn't scream a must-buy to me. Based on the performance claims AMD have made, this card should be $500 US. For example, back when AMD launched the RX 7800 XT at $500 US, its nearest competitor was the RTX 4070 at $600 US. The 7800 XT was not only a little bit faster than the 4070, but $100 cheaper as well, leading to 21% lower cost per frame in our day one review. The RX 9070 priced at $550 suggests to me a card with worse cost per frame than RDNA 3 when compared to the nearest GeForce competitor. That's not the direction we want to see, so hopefully this model is much more competitive than what AMD have shown. Of course, like with the 9070 XT, AMD could benefit from increased supply here as they've been shipping RDNA 4 models to retailers for months now. What we've heard is that retailers have significantly more stock of RX 9000 series GPUs than for some of the GeForce 50 series cards, so if AMD can actually hit $550 for all 9070s, while RTX 5070s debut at, say, 20% above MSRP like the other Blackwell models, AMD could benefit a bit in the short term. How that plays out long term as pricing normalizes, Not sure, and AMD will struggle more if these cards aren't as good as they've advertised today. Let's put pricing aside and move on now to some of the other interesting things about RDNA 4. Firstly, based on AMD's performance claims, the RDNA 4 architecture is more geared towards higher resolutions than lower resolutions. While the 9070 XT is claimed to be 42% faster than the 7900 GRE at 4K Ultra settings, at 1440p it's 38% faster than the 7900 GRE. It's not a massive difference. The relative uplift at 1440p is 3% less than at 4K, but it's still important to be aware of. Obviously, the huge and very important feature announcement AMD has made alongside RDNA 4 is Fidelity FX Super Resolution 4, which includes an ML-based upscaling solution. In my opinion, the current state of FSR 2.2 and FSR 3.1 upscaling is not competitive with DLSS 4, so to be competitive, AMD really desperately needs FSR 4 and for FSR 4 to be a huge improvement over their previous upscalers. With an AI upscaling algorithm as part of FSR 4, they are in with a much better chance of being competitive. Now, we can't take a deep look at FSR 4 until the review embargo for RDNA 4 lifts, and you can expect dedicated coverage after those GPU reviews, but I've already seen FSR 4 in action at CES and can confirm, based on at least that example, that FSR 4 is a large improvement over FSR 3.1. In the example we saw at CES, it was Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart using FSR 3.1 and FSR 4 performance modes. FSR 4 was obviously much better at upscaling from the low render resolution used in the performance mode, and this mode has historically delivered bad image quality with previous versions of FSR. Along with the announcement of RDNA 4, AMD provided a few additional examples to us, mostly still image comparisons showing differences in fine detail. I don't think these are particularly great examples for overall image quality improvement, so I'm just going off for now what I saw and showed in that CES FSR 4 preview. I was very impressed with what I saw, and I didn't think the FSR 4 performance mode was the performance mode until an AMD employee told me, and then I confirmed it in the settings. The big question that I can't answer right now, and I actually don't know, as of writing this script I can't test FSR 4 yet, is how close FSR 4 gets to DLSS. Are we talking DLSS 2 era quality, DLSS 3 era, DLSS 4 era? No idea really. DLSS 4 does make some significant gains in reducing TAA blur and improving image stability, so AMD have their work cut out for them to match what Nvidia offers. I think for this one though, there are multiple wins that AMD can achieve, and the more wins the better. The first win is a big increase to image quality compared to FSR 3.1, and I would be shocked if they haven't achieved that based on what I've seen. The second win is a big increase at lower and popular resolutions like 1440p and 1080p. The third win would be making FSR 4 meet the threshold of usable, which for many people would be DLSS 3-like quality. Yeah, maybe not as good as the latest versions of DLSS, but usable in a sense that the level of artifacting is low and acceptable, which it often isn't with older versions of FSR. Lots of gamers have enjoyed the experience with DLSS 3 and wouldn't necessarily be upset with that today. And the final win is matching or exceeding DLSS 4 image quality, which would be an outstanding result. They are coming from a fair way back, so I don't expect them to achieve all of these wins immediately, but ticking off a few of them would go a long way to closing the significant gap in upscalers, which is a big reason gamers flock to purchase GeForce GPUs. Now, the way FSR 4 works is interesting. The new algorithm relies on FP8 processing, which is a new accelerated capability in RDNA 4. This new architecture also drastically improves the performance of other data formats typically used for AI, like int8 and FP16, but it's FP8 that FSR 4 relies on. As such, FSR 4 is exclusive to RDNA 4 graphics cards and won't work on RDNA 3, at least initially. Now, AMD are leaving the door open to create some version of FSR 4 that works on older Radeon GPUs, but the reality is that the current version of FSR 4 won't work, so AMD would likely have to create a separate watered-down model for those cards, similar to what maybe Intel did with XeSS, where the better XMX version runs on ARC hardware and the lighter DP4A version runs on other cards. That is not confirmed to happen with FSR 4 and may never happen. The way FSR 4 is integrated into games, at least initially, is largely driver side. FSR 4 hooks into the FSR 3.1 API via the driver and replaces the upscaling pass with the FSR 4 algorithm whenever you enable FSR 3.1 in a game. This means that day one, all FSR 3.1 titles will be able to be upgraded to FSR 4 via the driver. For games using FSR 3 or FSR 2.2 or even some older versions, they will need to be upgraded to at least FSR 3.1 in the game to gain access to FSR 4. I'm sure there will also be a native implementation at some point, but it sounded like day one that all FSR 4 titles are via this driver upgrade path, similar to Nvidia's override feature for DLSS 4. The driver upgrade feature just deals with upscaling though. Other aspects to the FSR family, such as frame generation and anti-lag, still require game integration and use the existing game integration from FSR 3.1. So FSR 4 doesn't appear to be improving the quality of generated frames versus FSR 3. Also, frame generation is staying as single frame generation for now. AMD are not attempting to match Nvidia's multi-frame generation feature with this release. As for performance uplift, AMD have provided this chart which has FSR 4 upscaling and FSR 4 plus frame generation. The FSR upscaling mode used is the 4K performance mode. Now, in strictly looking at upscaling, AMD are claiming the performance mode on average across these 7 games will result in a 65% performance uplift over native 4K rendering. In our recent DLSS 4 investigation, we found DLSS 4 performance mode compared to native TAA at 4K resulted in a 74% performance improvement on the RTX 5080. With that said, there is some variance in these results. For example, at lower frame rates where the overhead of upscaling takes up less of the overall frame time and allows for a larger performance increase, FSR 4 is able to provide more of a 2x boost. Ratchet & Clank, for example, was exactly twice as fast. In that game, we found an 80% boost from DLSS 4 performance on the RTX 5080 at higher frame rates. In Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered, AMD are claiming a 38% performance uplift, which is very similar to what we saw from DLSS 4 performance in that title. So these are very promising performance results. The big issue for AMD at launch will be game support. While FSR 4 will be available in 30 plus games at launch, including titles like Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, Spider-Man 2, and Call of Duty Black Ops 6 through the driver upgrade system, this is still a relatively small number of games. Yes, more games than AMD usually delivers with an FSR release, but DLSS 4 is available in far more titles today because Nvidia has used an upgradable DLSS DLL for a lot longer. So GeForce owners can either use the override in the Nvidia app to officially upgrade over 70 games, or use unofficial DLL swaps to upgrade other DLSS 2 and 3 titles. Upgrading the many FSR 2.2 titles to FSR 4 will be much harder, and this will create a huge gulf between FSR 4 and DLSS 4 in official and especially unofficial game support at launch. Again, I think with FSR 4 game support, AMD should be targeting a number of small wins over time. Having 30 games at launch, including popular, well-received titles, is much better than the 2 unpopular titles like we saw at FSR 3's launch. But creating an ecosystem where FSR 4 is widely supported will be a much bigger effort, and it could be a while before AMD matches not only the quality of DLSS 4, but its game support. So hopefully AMD are truly investing big into upscaling here and are planning to enable that investment over a long period of time. Another eye-catching aspect of this launch were the claims that AMD are making around encoding quality, which is not something we normally cover on the channel. AMD's GPU encoders have been widely criticized for poor video encoding quality using popular formats and bit rates for game streaming, leaving Nvidia as the clear choice for anyone that wants to use video encoding. AMD are claiming with RDNA 4 that encoding quality is much better, and it's the examples they showed that were eye-catching. AMD specifically focused on 1080p H.264 encoding at 6 megabits per second, a very popular setup, showing a huge increase in visual quality in their example. No idea whether this will actually be true in practice across a broad variety of scenarios, but usually when AMD has talked about encoding quality, it's been about, say, support for new formats like AV1. With RDNA 4, AMD are really focusing on gains that should apply in currently used real-world scenarios, which suggest they are much more confident in the quality of their encoder. Putting some numbers to this, AMD are touting a 25% gain in H.264 low latency encode quality, an 11% improvement in HEVC, better AV1 encoding with B-frame support, and a 30% boost in encoding performance at 720p. I believe these mostly refer to VMAF scores. There are lots of other improvements to talk about here as well. The ray tracing core features 2 intersection engines instead of 1, doubling the throughput for ray box and ray triangle intersections. There's a new ray transform block, bringing some aspects of RT out of shaders and into the RT core. The BVH is twice as wide, and so on. Lots of improvements to the RT implementation here, which is why RDNA 4's ray tracing gains exceed the raster gains. As for the compute engine, there are lots of improvements here too. Then in addition, there's a PCI 5.0x16 interface and 256-bit memory bus using GDDR6. AMD are claiming enhanced memory compression here, plus you actually get 16GB of VRAM, which should be enough for a lot of modern games. The display engine is a bit of a mixed bag. While it does support DisplayPort 2.1, the capabilities relative to RDNA 3 are unchanged, with maximum bandwidth support of UHBR 13.5 instead of the full UHBR 20 that is now being used on some 4K 240Hz displays, and is also the bandwidth that NVIDIA supports with Blackwell. HDMI 2.1b is also included. However, AMD do claim idle power consumption is lower for multi-monitor setups, and video frame scheduling can now be offloaded to the GPU. The die itself is also relatively interesting. Navi 48 is 357 square millimeters of TSMC 4nm silicon, and it features 53.9 billion transistors. That is a 5% smaller die than NVIDIA's Blackwell GB203 used in the RTX 5080 and 5070 Ti, but it includes more transistors, 18% more, which means the design is more dense. Unfortunately, this means NVIDIA are still quite ahead when it comes to area and transistor efficiency, as the RTX 5080 is likely to be around 15% faster in rasterization and possibly over 50% faster for ray tracing based on AMD's RX 9070 XT claims, and all of that is with fewer transistors and a smaller die size. However, the TDP of the RTX 5080 is 360 watts compared to 304 watts for the 9070 XT, which is 18% higher, though not necessarily representative of actual power consumption in games. The 9070 XT should be closer to an RTX 5070 Ti with its 300 watt TDP. Couple of additional things to round this one out. AMD are not making a reference model of the RX 9070 XT or RX 9070, so all designs will be coming from partners. These partners include Asus, Gigabyte, PowerColor, Sapphire, XFX, all the usual guys. There should be a lot of availability on March 6th, as these cards have been ready since the start of January. AMD are releasing a new version of their driver-based frame generation, AFMF 2.1, which will be available for the RX 6000 series and newer. This version promises superior image quality, and there's also Radeon image sharpening too, which can be applied to any games, videos, or apps at the driver level. AMD claims better quality for that. There's also some AI stuff, which, yeah, cool. So that does it for AMD's RDNA 4 and RX 9000 series announcement. Mixed feelings on the price, though it's certainly not as bad as it could have been, and both FSR4 and video encoding quality look promising. I think AMD are well positioned to capitalize on NVIDIA's current supply issues and ludicrous pricing, but long term, it's still iffy whether these GPUs are competitive enough to see a better sales trend than RDNA 3. Lots to play out there, and of course it will depend heavily on how good these models actually perform, how good FSR4 actually is compared to DLSS 4, and so on. So anyway, that's it for this one. If you're wondering how we got this video out talking about the price just shortly after AMD announced the price in their live stream, well, I actually made a number of different versions of this video. So if you're watching this version of the video, the price was set at $600 and $550, which is kind of the middle option that we sort of prepared for. Thankfully, we didn't have to push the go live button on the $650 version because that one really tore shreds into AMD. There was also a few better versions that we could have gone with if the pricing was a little bit better. So yeah, sort of a middle option of the variety that we produced. So yeah, interesting one. Luckily we were able to, predict the price right, so we could push at least one of these videos out. Didn't really want to be up at midnight correcting this video with changes to the price and so on. But I think the price is so important with this release that I didn't want to publish without the price on the NDA date. Really wanted all that pricing info in there. So this was the way to do it. So yeah, anyway, if you want to support our independent analysis, all the stuff that we do for these sorts of releases and things, then consider supporting us on Patreon. Links to that's in the description below. Steve and I will be burning the midnight oil to do a late night podcast episode talking about all of this good stuff. So stay tuned for that in the Hardware Unboxed podcast channel. Yeah, I'm tired for making like 6 versions of this video. So yeah, let's edit them all together and yeah, we'll see which one comes out. So yeah, that'll do it for this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.